They spoke of her before she ever arrived, as society always does when a woman's fate is decided without her consent. In parlors thick with afternoon light and unspoken judgments, over tea served in porcelain too delicate to grip honestly, her name was mentioned with the careful politeness reserved for disappointments. She was not the daughter meant for the Duke. She was the one offered because the beautiful one had declined. Flora Davis learned of her destiny on a morning when even the weather seemed apologetic. Rain fell in steady sheets against the drawing-room windows, turning the world beyond into watercolor smears of gray and green. The roses her father had planted years ago drooped heavy with water, their petals surrendering to the ground like small acts of mourning. Her mother did not meet her eyes when she delivered the news. She stood near the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble edge as though steadying herself against what she was about to say. Jane had refused the arrangement. The Duke required a bride. Circumstances, her mother explained with practiced delicacy, demanded flexibility. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Flora listened without speaking because she had been taught since childhood that her role was to accommodate, not to question. Jane's name was handled with reverence, wrapped in explanations about delicate constitutions and sensitivities too refined for such a formidable match. Beauty, it was understood, should be protected from hardship. Flora, by contrast, had always possessed a steadier disposition. She read more than was appropriate for a woman, spoke less than was expected in social settings, and had a face that observers described as pleasant when they bothered to describe it at all. These qualities were now being repackaged as advantages, as though her very ordinariness had prepared her for a life of being overlooked. Duke Baxter Brown of Ashcombe was a man of substantial reputation. His bloodline stretched back through centuries of influence, his lands were prosperous and vast, his standards reportedly inflexible. The marriage contract had been negotiated like a treaty between nations, every detail calibrated for maximum benefit to both families. Flora understood this even as her mother assured her that she should feel honored by the opportunity. She had learned long ago that honor and obligation often wore the same face. When her mother finally left her alone, Flora did not immediately give in to tears. She moved to the window and watched the servants loading her belongings into the carriage, their movements efficient and impersonal. She thought of Jane somewhere in the house, perhaps in her sunny bedroom with its view of the garden, free now from a burden she had never truly been asked to bear. Only then did Flora feel it, a weight settling behind her ribs, making each breath require conscious effort, as though even her body understood it was being sent where it was not wanted. The journey north began in the thin light before dawn. The carriage lamps flickered against the darkness, casting restless shadows on the road ahead. Flora sat with perfect posture, hands folded over the travel blanket across her lap, feeling each jolt and sway as a reminder that she was being delivered somewhere, like a piece of correspondence that required signing for. She did not allow herself to imagine affection or tenderness. She imagined courtesy, perhaps mutual respect if she proved capable enough, and the kind of silence that could be endured for a lifetime. Ashcombe emerged from the mist like something from a cautionary tale. The estate's stone walls bore the stains of centuries, darkened by weather and time, into something that looked more like judgment than architecture. Iron gates stood closed until the last possible moment, as though the house itself were reluctant to admit her. Windows reflected back only the colorless sky, revealing nothing of what awaited inside. Flora felt the carriage slow, felt her heart respond with an unwelcome flutter of panic. She straightened her shoulders before the door opened, smoothing her traveling cloak as though presentation alone might earn her the right to exist here. Inside, Ashcam spoke in the language of restraint and old money. The scent of beeswax and lavender hung in the air, undercut by the sharper notes of polished wood and cold stone. Servants moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their faces arranged in expressions of professional neutrality. Flora was guided to a sitting room done in shades of cream and pale gold, furnished with uncomfortable elegance. She was informed, with flawless courtesy, that Duke Brown would receive her shortly. The phrasing made her stomach tighten, as though she were a petitioner awaiting verdict rather than a bride arriving at her new home. She permitted herself one glance in the mirror hanging above the writing desk. It showed her what she already knew, a woman of 24 with dark hair pinned back in a style too practical to be fashionable, eyes that reflected more worry than she wished to reveal, a face that was neither memorable nor entirely plain. She thought of Jane's luminous smile, her gift for making any room feel warmer simply by entering it, and felt the familiar sensation of occupying space that had been meant for someone else. When the door opened, it did so with quiet authority rather than announcement. Duke Baxter Brown entered alone, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around his presence. He was taller than she had imagined, his bearing suggesting both confidence and careful control, as though he had learned early to measure his effect on a space. His expression gave away nothing, no disappointment, no approval, no reaction whatsoever to the fact that the wrong sister now stood before him. His gaze found hers and held it with a directness that made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Flora curtsied, each motion executed exactly as she had practiced in her mother's drawing room. She spoke the words she had rehearsed during the long journey north, acknowledging her arrival, expressing gratitude for the match, promising to fulfill every expectation that had been established. Her voice remained steady even as her hands trembled slightly within her gloves. What she could not know, what she could not yet allow herself to imagine, was that Duke Baxter Brown had known since the morning Jane refused that he would be receiving Flora instead, and that he had specifically requested it be her. The morning her mother delivered the news, Flora had been reading by the window, a book hidden beneath her embroidery. Rain struck the glass in rhythms that matched her pulse as her mother's words settled into the room like unwelcome guests. Jane would not be going to Ashcam. Flora would. The explanation came wrapped in gentleness, Jane's delicate nerves, the family's obligation, Flora's own dependable nature. Her mother's hands never stopped moving, straightening cushions that required no attention, as though activity might soften what was being asked. Flora set down her needle and thread without protest. She had been raised to understand that a daughter's purpose was to serve her family's interests, and she had watched Jane receive every advantage, every kindness, every assumption of future happiness. This, then, was her role. When the carriage arrived that afternoon, Flora stood in the doorway and looked back at the garden where the roses hung heavy with rain, their petals scattering across the gravel like small surrenders. Her father did not emerge to say goodbye. Jane remained in her room. Only her mother offered a brief embrace, whispering that duty was its own form of dignity. Flora climbed into the carriage alone, and as it pulled away, she did not look back again. The journey to Ashcombe stretched across 2 days, each mile reinforcing her sense of displacement. Flora watched the landscape shift from familiar fields to unfamiliar moorland, the sky growing heavier as they travelled north. She slept fitfully in coaching inns where the walls were thin and the beds smelled of strangers. On the second afternoon, the carriage slowed at iron gates that seemed designed to discourage entry. Beyond them, Ashcombe rose from the mist, stone walls darkened by centuries, windows reflecting nothing, gardens severe and formal. Flora's hands tightened in her lap as the gate swung open with a sound like judgment. When she stepped down from the carriage, the gravel crunched beneath her shoes with finality. A housekeeper appeared, her face professionally neutral, and guided Flora through corridors that smelled of beeswax and secrets. She was shown to a small sitting room and told the Duke would receive her shortly. Flora waited, spine straight, heart unsteady. When the door opened, Duke Baxter Brown entered with a presence that seemed to still the air itself. He was taller than she had imagined, his features composed, his gaze meeting hers with unsettling directness. Flora curtsied, offering the practiced words of gratitude and duty. He listened without interrupting, his expression revealing nothing, his silence more unnerving than any criticism could have been. Before we go on, if this story has captured your interest, please like the video and subscribe for more. 3 days passed in careful distance. Flora took her meals alone, walked the gardens when servants assured her it was appropriate, and spent her evenings in the sitting room assigned to her. The house felt like a place that observed rather than welcomed. On the 4th morning, she noticed something that had not been there before, a book resting on the side table near the window. It was old, the leather binding worn soft with use, the title embossed in faded gold, A Comprehensive History of the Northern Counties. Flora's breath caught. She had mentioned her interest in history to no one here, had been careful to present herself as appropriately modest in her intellectual pursuits. Yet here was a book that suggested someone had been paying attention to more than her words. She opened it carefully, finding annotations in the margins, observations, questions, arguments with the author's conclusions. The handwriting was precise and confident. She traced a finger over one note, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. That evening at dinner, when Duke Baxter asked if she had found everything she needed in her rooms, Flora met his eyes and said, with quiet honesty, that she had found more than she expected. Something flickered across his expression, satisfaction, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. He inclined his head slightly, and Flora felt the first crack in the wall she had built around her expectations. By the 2nd week, Flora had established a careful routine designed to require nothing and offend no one. She rose early, read in her sitting room, took walks when the weather permitted, and appeared at meals with perfect punctuality. The household staff treated her with polite distance, as though awaiting confirmation of her permanence before investing in familiarity. So when Duke Baxter requested her presence at luncheon with several of his stewards and neighboring landowners, Flora assumed it was a formality, a presentation of the new Duchess for assessment and dismissal. She dressed carefully, arrived precisely on time, and took her seat at the table's edge, prepared to be decorative and silent. The conversation turned to estate management, crop rotations, a dispute over grazing rights. Flora listened with the attention she gave to everything, her mind organizing the information even as she kept her expression neutral. Then Duke Baxter turned to her directly, his voice cutting through the others. "Mrs. Davis, you've reviewed the household accounts. What's your assessment of the discrepancy in the quarter's expenditures?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her, some startled, others openly skeptical. Flora felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not look away from Baxter's steady gaze. She had, in fact, reviewed the accounts, not because she had been asked, but because understanding the estate's functioning seemed prudent. She answered carefully, noting the unusual increase in stable costs that did not align with the season's activities. Baxter nodded slowly, and one of the stewards cleared his throat in grudging acknowledgement. As the meal continued, Flora felt the weight of judgment pressing against her from all sides, but also something new, Baxter's attention, focused and approving, like sunlight breaking through cloud. The afternoon was unseasonably mild for late autumn, and Duke Baxter suggested they walk the estate's gardens. Flora accepted with surprise, uncertain whether this was duty or something less easily named. They moved along gravel paths lined with hedges trimmed into geometric precision, past flower beds preparing for winter's sleep. Baxter walked beside her, his pace measured to match hers, his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke of the estate's history, the gardens his grandmother had designed, the orchard that would bloom in spring. Flora listened, offering observations when silence seemed to expect them, and found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the conversation. They reached a place where the path narrowed, roots from an old oak breaking through the stones. Flora's foot caught slightly, and Baxter's hand moved, not to grasp her arm, but to hover near her elbow, close enough to steady her if needed, but waiting for permission to make contact. The gesture lasted only a moment, but Flora felt it reverberate through her awareness. When she glanced back toward the house, she saw a curtain fall back into place in an upper window. That evening, the housekeeper's manner was subtly altered, more watchful. The maid who helped Flora dress spoke less freely. By the following morning, Flora understood that the household had noted the Duke's attention, and that such attention, directed toward the replacement bride, was being catalogued as something close to scandal. The air in Ashcombe had shifted, humming with restrained speculation, and Flora found herself at the center of a story she had not written. Flora was summoned to the library on a morning when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns. She entered to find Duke Baxter standing before the fireplace, his posture suggesting he had been waiting with purpose rather than patience. He gestured for her to sit, but remained standing himself, his gaze steady on hers. "I owe you honesty," he began, his voice carrying the weight of something rehearsed but sincere. Flora's hands tightened in her lap as he continued. He had known, he explained, before she ever arrived, that Jane had refused the arrangement. More than that, when the proposal had been made to redirect the contract to Flora, he had not simply accepted the substitution. He had requested it. Flora felt the words land like stones in still water, their implications rippling outward. "You requested me," as she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Baxter moved closer, his expression revealing something she had not seen before, uncertainty, as though he stood on ground that might shift beneath him. He had made inquiries, he admitted. He had learned of her intelligence, her reading habits that supposedly exceeded what was appropriate, her preference for substance over performance. I did not want a bride chosen for her ability to ornament a room, he said quietly. I wanted someone I could speak to. Flora stared at him, years of being overlooked suddenly reframing themselves into something she did not yet know how to name. And my sister, she asked, needing to understand. Your sister, Baxter said carefully, would have been miserable here. And I suspect I would have disappointed her considerably. It was not cruelty in his voice, but assessment, the same clear-eyed honesty he had shown in their conversations about estate management and history. Flora rose slowly, her mind racing through every interaction since her arrival, reinterpreting each moment through this new lens. She was not the consolation prize. She had been chosen deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with duty or resignation. The realization settled into her chest like warmth spreading through cold hands. The winter gathering was announced with only a week's notice, a tradition Duke Baxter apparently honored more from obligation than enthusiasm. The great hall was opened, fires lit in hearths that had been cold since Flora's arrival. Guests arrived from neighboring estates, filling Ashcombe with noise and scrutiny. Flora dressed with meticulous care, knowing she would be evaluated with the particular cruelty society reserved for women who occupied positions they had not been born to. The evening unfolded in precisely the way she had dreaded, polite greetings that barely concealed assessment, conversations that stopped when she approached, glances that catalogued every detail of her appearance and found it wanting. She stood near one of the tall windows, holding a glass of wine she had not tasted, when a ripple of surprise moved through the room. Flora turned to see the butler announcing a late arrival, his voice carrying over the music and conversation. Miss Jane Davis. Flora's wine glass nearly slipped from her hand. Jane swept into the room in a gown of ice blue silk, her beauty as undeniable as it had always been, her smile bright and unapologetic. She moved through the guests like someone reclaiming territory, accepting their admiration as her natural right. When her eyes found Flora's, there was something in them that made Flora's stomach tighten, triumph, perhaps, or the satisfaction of someone who had decided to stop refusing what was being offered. Jane approached Duke Baxter with practiced grace, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. Your Grace, I hope it is not too late to accept what I once, in my foolishness, declined. The room held its collective breath, and Flora felt the ground beneath her shift in ways she could not yet calculate. Duke Baxter looked at Jane Davis with the same careful assessment he had given everything since Flora had known him, measured, unhurried, revealing nothing of his thoughts until he chose to speak them. The silence stretched long enough that several guests shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they were witnessing a reconciliation or something else entirely. Then Baxter turned, his gaze finding Flora's across the room, and in that moment she understood that whatever happened next had already been decided. Miss Davis, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the music that had faltered into uncertainty, you honor me with your interest. However, the arrangement we are discussing was fulfilled the moment your sister arrived at Ashcombe and accepted her place here. He moved through the gathered guests, stopping beside Flora with a deliberateness that made her pulse quicken. Mrs. Flora Davis stands here not by default or necessity, but because I chose her specifically. That choice is not one I have any intention of correcting. The words landed like a declaration in a court of law, final, unarguable, public. Flora felt heat rise to her face as every eye in the room turned toward her, but Baxter's hand moved to rest lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of unmistakable support. Jane's expression flickered between shock and something darker before she recovered her composure, offering a brittle smile and a gracious concession that fooled no one. As the evening continued, Flora felt the shift in how people approached her, no longer with dismissive politeness, but with wary respect. Baxter had claimed her publicly, in a way that left no room for society's revision or doubt. The days following the winter gathering were strange and clarifying in equal measure. Jane departed Ashcombe the next morning, her carriage disappearing down the drive with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter Flora had never asked to be part of. The household's manner toward her changed, not dramatically, but in small acknowledgments that she was no longer provisional. The housekeeper consulted her about menus. The head gardener asked her preferences for the spring plantings. Baxter continued their walks and their conversations, but now without the careful distance that had characterized their early interactions. One evening, as they sat in the library with books open but largely ignored, Flora finally asked the question that had been building since his declaration. "Were you not concerned about how society would judge your choice?" Baxter considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Society will judge regardless of what I choose. I decided I would rather be judged for choosing what I wanted than for accepting what was expected." Flora absorbed this, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. She had spent her entire life arranging herself around other people's expectations, making herself smaller and quieter and more convenient. But here was someone who had looked at her, truly seen her, and decided she was worth defending publicly, worth choosing deliberately. "I am still learning," she said slowly, "how to believe I deserve to be chosen." Baxter's gaze met hers with unmistakable warmth. "Then we will learn it together." And in that moment, Flora understood that she was no longer simply receiving decisions made about her life. She was, for perhaps the first time, actively participating in writing her own story, not as a replacement for someone else, but as herself, chosen and choosing in return. If this tale has stirred your curiosity, a simple like or subscription is most appreciated. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from. Thank you.